Today we're going to discuss what were the Dark Ages. Yay! And the reason why we're discussing what were the Dark Ages is because I keep on seeing this come up again and again and again. And so, there's a definition of Dark Ages that's really quite important, and it really needs to be looked at and evaluated because this isn't something that's a matter of opinion. This is actually a hard and fast sort of thing, which a lot of people get mistaken. So, first off, what were the Dark Ages? There was no such thing. It's all propaganda. The entire thing, concept of Dark Ages, is propaganda. Always has been. This isn't to say that individual civilizations haven't had Dark Ages. Okay, after the Bronze Age collapse, most of the Mediterranean and large chunks of the Middle East underwent a Dark Ages, so to speak, where things that had been centralized were decentralized and grew in their own way. You had civilizations that were more united, such as the Mycenaean Greeks, that became the city-state Greeks that we know and love. That classical Greece was. So Dark Ages have occurred in history. That said, they tend to be localized to a very specific part of the world, and usually only a few civilizations. The Bronze Age collapse was one of the biggest shifts. If they had ruled their empire differently, the Mongol invasions could have done the same thing. In both cases, you have a bunch of nomads running rampant over established civilizations and utterly destroying and conquering them. For the people who surrounded them, the Aztec civilization was a dark age because, they lost everything in favor of an extremely bloody and terrifying and brutal dictatorship underneath the Aztecs. So, but these have all been caused by external events, and the remaining issues have been opposed by external events. There are short Dark Ages, which are global, but those usually follow some incredible catastrophe, almost always a global or large-scale pandemic, such as smallpox in the Americas or the Black Death in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And those tend to be short, sharp shocks of horror, but there tends to be recovery shortly afterwards. Most people, when they talk about Dark Ages, are actually talking about a time period from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance. And the reason why, or at least until the reign of Charlemagne, which is around 800. And the reason why they tend to talk about this is because this was established as a Dark Ages by propaganda produced by people in the Renaissance and then hammered home by Northern Europeans and the French in the Age of Reason, which is as valid as definition for that time period as the Dark Ages is for the time that came right after Rome. And this is a way of making yourself feel better because obviously those people who were different than you were inferior in every way and inferior to the classical civilization that you're modeling yourself on. Well, here's a few things that did not happen in the Dark Ages. First off, and this is very rarely the case except with a few distinct and unfortunately very vocal cults. Religion and science don't tend to fight each other, and they definitely didn't do it during the time period people call the Dark Ages. If anything, the reverse was true. The two most advanced civilizations in the world at the time, the Byzantine Empire which was actually the Roman Empire. We only call it the Byzantine afterwards to distinguish it from the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates were both either near theocracies in the case of the Byzantines or complete theocracies in the case of the Islamic states, and they were both centers of learning and scientific advancement, and we wouldn't be where we are today without the efforts of those people. So religion and science interfering with each other is a myth, complete myth, except again with the case of certain cults which need to stymie science, or in the case of the Marxists and the New Atheists and other people like that, need to stymie religion in order to use the power that those disciplines provide and take it onto themselves. It's always done to make yourself the sole speaker in terms of how people should behave, how people should think, and how the information should be spread. So, didn't happen during the time after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and I'm going to clarify that because it's only the Western Roman Empire that collapsed, and even then, calling it a collapse is kind of iffy. Maybe I'll do a video about that, but calling it a collapse isn't quite accurate. Now, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the part that anybody cared about, was doing fine. In fact, under Justinian, with his general Belisarius, they almost reconquered the entire damn thing. It was only a plague that kept them from doing so. These plagues caused minor dark ages. So one thing I want you to remember is, you see this? Dark Ages used to describe the entire world from about 400 to 800. This is the part that was actually affected. Right there. This small little area right here. And even then, it wasn't terribly affected. In a lot of cases, especially for the average person, life got better. But it's right here. To zoom in, things were going extremely well here, all across here, large parts of here, definitely here, amazingly well here. This was a complete mess, but when isn't it? All throughout here. These guys were doing fine. These guys were having a little minor problem of their own, but it had nothing to do with the collapse of the Roman Empire. It had more to do with the Great Pause, which was when the Polynesians stopped settling for about 1,000 years. There are people who know much more about this. These guys were just kicking it, doing whatever they were doing. Over here, these guys here were doing amazing things. There was some fun stuff happening here, and here, and here. Nothing was happening here. And as always, Canada did buckus. So let's narrow it down even further and get to the part that people actually are talking about. Again, see this big map? This is the map of the known world at the time, known by the Europeans, except for this large chunks of India and the rest over here. So this was where their trade network reached. Okay? Do you want to know what was in the Dark Ages? This part always had been. Well, it hadn't never been in a Dark Age because it had never been in a Golden Age. Not yet. This part, not really in a Dark Age, because actually life was much better there. Especially after the Romans reorganized things, and then they got home rule when the Roman Empire collapsed. This part actually did hurt because having a bunch of these guys come over and take apart the Roman infrastructure was actually really bad. These guys had a golden age. Yes, that's right. Ireland had a golden age, and it was there. And it was stopped by these guys coming over and beating the crap out of them because they had a golden age and they had lots of wealth. So, you want to know who didn't have the Dark Age again? This was Spain's golden age. Right here. During the Dark Ages, until about 1200, the Iberian Peninsula was in a golden age with the with the Emirate of Cordoba. And if you want to study that, that's an amazing time period. These people doing quite well. Muslim conquest had settled a bunch of problems. I mean, it was bloodthirsty and awful for a lot of people, but afterwards it settled down. But then again, you can say that about any empire. These guys kicking ass all over the place. Baghdad, right around here, one of the most important cities in the world at this time. And things like friggin' math, astronomy, algebra, alchemy, which would become chemistry, all started here. That's the reason why alchemy, algebra, and the like have the names they do, as well as a lot of stars in the sky, because it came out of here during the Muslim Golden Age, when observations were being made and recorded properly for the first time. These guys, a bunch of barbarians, so they didn't have. But eventually they were conquered by these guys and these guys. These guys here, they had friggin' robots. Programmable robots. Mechanical programmable robots. It's attested to in multiple sources, especially Liutprand of Cremona's embassy to Constantinople. When you have friggin' robots, that means you're doing pretty well, especially if it's 600, 700 AD. They had flamethrowers. Okay? They were taking out their enemies with flamethrowers, and they were watching friggin' robots in their throne rooms. Okay? They had a trade network that stretched over to China. That's not a dark age. That's a friggin' golden age, especially for this. Same thing was occurring in Greece, which was getting all the benefits. Parts of Venice was over here, part of the same whole network. You know, again. And look how small this part is, the world is. Now, here's the big difference. Italy and the Renaissance wanted some claim to being more important than all of this stuff. Okay? And parts of this stuff. So they started declaring this to be the Dark Ages. And it was a poetic term. Okay, from the time period of the fall of Rome around the 450s. And really, again, Rome didn't collapse in the 450s. That was when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. And you could argue that this part of the empire had collapsed well before that, or had dissolved. I like dissolved matter because it didn't really collapse. It's just kind of, what's a good way to say it? Everybody else around them had become so indistinguishable from the Romans that there was, it just kind of ceased to be useful. Maybe a good way to put it. There wasn't much difference. And then, later on, during the Age of Reason, you get people here and here who are like saying, especially people who do not like the Catholics, or the Orthodox, or the Muslims, which notice all this area, Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim. Actually, all this goes all the way over there, too. Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims. So they don't like these people. So they're saying that this is a dark age, and it was caused by the Catholics taking over. At least that's Gibbon's take on the collapse of the Roman Empire. Again, he ignores this part. And a lot of people agreed completely with him because, hey, if you're a Protestant or atheist, although that entire concept is much more recent than you would think, atheist in the past usually meant person who doesn't worship the state, someone who doesn't believe in any gods. For example, frequently the Hebraic peoples over here, or the Christians in this area during the Roman, were considered atheists because they only worshiped one god and it wasn't any of the approved ones. That happened again and again. Monotheists all over the place, even in Persia, considered before the Zoroastrianism became a thing. Thought that there was a lot of issues with monotheism being considered atheism in a long time. Kit Marlowe, the famous spy / playwright, was convicted of atheism or put on trial for atheism because he was a raving Catholic. Punishment for atheism was much lower than the punishment for being a raving Catholic, because under Queen Elizabeth, the punishment for being a raving Catholic was frequently death. So, um, anyway, so these people didn't particularly care for the fact that all this advancement had happened in all these places with people who have darker skin and people who worship worship the right God, but in the wrong way. Yeah, I mean, there were Jews there, and they didn't kill witches. That's a myth. The Dark Ages, no one killed witches. Witch killing actually starts primarily. Witch killing goes back tens of thousands of years. Okay, first. Second, during the Dark Ages, there was a hiatus in witch killing because during the Christian era in the Roman Republic, Roman Empire, and to today, witch killing was considered a bad idea because, first off, they contended there wasn't any such thing as magic, and therefore there were no such things as practicing witches, real practicing witches. There was even a commission that resolved itself in 900 showing that that was the case, and another commission that resolved itself in 1500s reinforcing this idea, and in both cases that was upheld as like reasons why you don't execute witches. And you don't see any witch executions in this region except at the local level. There's no occasionally it was done by the state, but it was never done by the church. Now when you get Protestantism, they get witch killings all over the place, and you see the biggest witch killings happen in the 1500s to the 1700s. And in fact, that was one of the impetuses for, that was one of the things that Martin Luther complained about the Catholics. They weren't killing enough witches or Jews. So, anyways, so all these things were blamed on this, and that made this a lot of things that didn't happen. For example, there's the myth that the medieval, by the way, Dark Ages is preferably called the early medieval era now, and the reason is because it is the medieval era. I mean, people were well bathed, more so than they would be in the Renaissance, up through possibly the 1750s, maybe even later. People had better hygiene, better food supply than they would up through the reestablishment of large-scale trade networks. And I mean, because these guys all had large-scale trade networks. And of course, I'm not even talking about the rest of the world, which was doing well and often surpassing, but not as often as China claimed. India actually was doing much better. They were inventing things like steel centuries before anybody else was. I mean, the concept of zero comes from India. We get it through these guys over here. I'm going to put down a map. So the entire concept is utter hooey. It's absolutely propaganda. Anybody who says that the Dark Ages brought in some sort of period of, what's a good word for it? Misery, things that people think of when they say medieval. Well, that's just not the case, because here's what happened to the average person. They had more economic independence. They had better access to their leaders, okay? Because you weren't sending someone down to Rome, if that. You were more likely dealing with some feudal lord whose position may have devolved from the Romans, but you actually could go talk to them, and you had more interaction with your leaders, and actually more say because of number one, economic independence. It always comes down to economics. You had, again, this camera thing's screwing me, better hygiene and healthcare, and access to fresh running water frequently, bathing, ridiculous amounts of sex that you wouldn't see until the Victorian era, maybe, 1700s. And a whole host of other fun things. You had scholarship out the wazoo. This is when universities were invented. This is when large-scale studies were being done for the first time. And I mean like centuries long, hundreds of people involved studies. like hundreds of scholars involved in studies. You had basically systematization of scholarship. You had things like moving, and this is key, and this ties in with economics. You had moving away from using human labor to using animal and environmental labor. So energy supply in the early Middle Ages shifted from slaves, not to say that there weren't slaves, because basically until, well, still going on in a lot of places in the world, there were slaves everywhere. It's only in the 1800s you start to see people stop using slaves. But slaves weren't as key to the economy because you had mechanical power from windmills and water wheels and things like this, as well as the horse collar and better yoking for oxen, which meant that you could use animal power as well. I mean, sure, there were animal-powered elevators in the market, which was Trajan, I believe it's Hadrian's Market in Rome, which is basically the world's first mall. But, that was rare and a one-off. So a lot of the shift away from using slaves starts here, because in the ancient world that was pretty much, you had to use them because that was the only option anybody would accept. I mean, you got a bunch of captives from previous wars. Why not throw them? You have to do something with them, and if you're not going to kill them, you might as well force them to work. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying that the only two options for the ends of wars were usually you get killed or you get enslaved if you lost. Usually genocided. If you were lucky, your civilization would have some remnant left. The Romans were innovative, and the Persians were innovative in that they didn't literally genocide everybody, and they allowed people to keep their own cultures. So, and those cultures thrived during the early Middle Ages. So, let's go back to the basic premise. The Dark Ages are a propaganda machine. It still is a propaganda machine. Anybody who says to you that the Dark Ages were real, well, modern scholarship shows otherwise. In fact, this was considered bunkum back in the 1400s, in the 1700s. But there were enough influential people to spread this idea around, especially when they were able to point it out. Well, those were the things that dark-skinned people were doing, and therefore it doesn't count. And by dark skin, I mean they're literally talking about this skin color and darker. That's not that dark. People who have slight tans, people who aren't pale as ghosts. So those people, obviously what they didn't count. So, and we don't have records of what the other people did because, well, we destroyed all our infrastructure. The Germans coming in did, and so that didn't work out. So, yeah, there was no such thing as the medieval Dark Ages. It just didn't exist. It's all propaganda. I'm Joseph Cadotte. I do this ill-informed opinions thing I'm trying to do once a week. I've been successful thus far. We'll see. Feel free to comment or ask questions or send suggestions. I wrote Dis, which is a science fiction espionage romance. I wrote Dis, which is a space princess revenge fantasy. Well, space opera. And then I wrote a story and compiled this, which is alternate history stuff. And then there is another book which we've recently issued called Fake News, which is alternate histories based on conspiracy theories. So feel free to contact me whenever you want. Bye.